Okay, can you hear me all right? So good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Tracy, for asking me to come and speak. I know I was not the first choice, apparently. I'm not offended in the slightest. It's just an honor to be able to come and speak to such a large group and such a meaningful group. So I have spoken to pretty much every kind of audience there is in this area of violence, particularly against women. And so I always try to tailor it for my audiences. And as I'm not all that familiar with everything that's going on in BC, I hope that I'm not being repetitive of anything you've already heard today, but I'm going to give you a broader perspective about family violence and what we can do about it as advocates, whether we're in the criminal justice system, or whether we're frontline, whether we're in the government, whether we're community service agencies. In my respectful view, this is what everybody needs to do in order to improve response in whatever sector you work in. I'm not sure if okay, here we go. So this is you've all read about the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review, I'm sure. All right, so this is what they have found since 2002. They've done in-depth death reviews of probably over 300 deaths by now, perhaps more. They come out with a report probably every 2 or 3 years, but this is what they find repeatedly. Although it is improving, that police basically have limited capacity to be more proactive. They don't really understand what triggers are in high-risk cases. They lack knowledge, specific knowledge of risk-enhancing factors, risk-reducing factors, and they have a hard time sharing information, and to this day they still do, of course, and there's a good reason for that. Barriers to informed decision-making by courts, in particular, are not that dissimilar, but there's no knowledge of the context or the history of a relationship. So if I'm prosecuting a domestic violence case, and it is the umpteenth time that the victim has been abused by her partner, but the first time she's called police and the first time charges have been laid, and what I'm dealing with is a punch in the face that only had redness when police responded, and we don't even have photographs of the serious bruising and swelling that occurred a day or two later. She comes to court, and I talk to her in the ante room before we're gonna go to trial, and she thinks that she can tell the court everything that's happened to her in the past 3, 4, 5, however many years she's been with her partner, including being strangled to unconsciousness, including being sexually assaulted. And my response to her is, you cannot talk about that information, because we are here with regard to that isolated event where he allegedly punched you or hit you in the face. That's all you get to talk about. So her reaction to me is disbelief and horror and fear, because now she knows that this is relatively minor compared to everything else that's occurred. So she asked me, what's going to happen to him? Well, he has no criminal record except for perhaps maybe an impaired driving conviction. He's going to get probation at most, if we get a conviction. So her first instinct is to bolt, correct? Because as soon as we're finished that matter in court, he's coming home. One way or the other, either legally or illegally, he's going to be able to get to her. So this is a problem for us. The court doesn't understand risk factors, and it's very difficult, other than at bail hearings or sentencing hearings, to get these factors before court so they have a better understanding of what a high-risk case looks like and who might be dangerous. Lawyers, there looks like you had some family law sessions here, correct? So you all understand that in the Edmonton courthouse anyway, where everything is all together, you can have an accused in criminal docket court that morning for forcibly confining his partner, strangling her, and committing aggravated assault because he broke her cheekbone and broke her jawbone. That afternoon, he's out on bail. That afternoon, he's literally across the hall in family court doing what? Getting access to his children. Okay, so does the family court have access to the police report? No. The only thing the family court gets is what the victim says in her affidavit. Okay, and then he files a corresponding affidavit saying all of those allegations are untrue. There's no prosecutor, there's no police report, there's no police officer, and this is where we're left. And the information that's contained in the police report is not disclosable to the family lawyer or to anybody else because of information sharing issues, correct? So these are the obstacles and the barriers that we're facing. Also the common assumptions. Oh, it's a one-off. I can't tell you how many times I've been sentencing in a domestic violence case where defense has stood up and said, this was the first time, it was out of character for him, he's never done that in the past. How likely is that? He's telling his lawyer that, and his lawyer probably wants to believe him, but it's not very likely. We know statistically, there's all sorts of research, but it's anywhere from 7 times to 33 times I've read that a woman is abused before she picks up the phone to call police. So by and large, this is never the first time. They're mutually combative. We get that all the time. I'm going to cover off some really good material respecting that as well, how we differentiate the serious violent offenders from the actual, minor ones. Both parents should have access to children. Yeah, if both parents are normal and healthy, absolutely. But that's not always the case. Victim is safer after separation. Who here would agree with that? When's the most dangerous time for women? When they leave, right? So traumatized parent is perceived as having lacking in parental abilities. Yeah, because why? She's traumatized. She's fearful, and she does not present well. So for a member of the bench that doesn't understand post-traumatic stress disorder in domestic violence victims or terrorization that occurs psychologically, they may not understand that. So history and context is absolutely everything. So the most recent event is not as important as the cumulative effect that abuse and violence has had on the victim. History and context is absolutely everything when we're talking about intimate partner violence. And here's an example of a family that was murdered by the male father figure and husband after separation. And what is the first line in the news report? This is an Ottawa case. Is that the family is upset with police because they saw it coming. The police had been engaged but didn't do much. Why? Because police are trained, they get the call, they go to the crime scene, they investigate that incident. And they're not looking into the background, and they're not looking into the history, and they're not even asking. When I first started doing these cases in 2000, the police would actually say to victims, I don't want to hear about it, ma'am, just tell me what happened today. We've changed that in Alberta. The police have to ask 19 risk-specific questions every time they go to a domestic. It's called FEVER. It's mandated in the province of Alberta, so now they're forced to get the history and the context. So how can we help? So this is what I'm going to talk about as quickly as I can today. I better talk faster. So these are the things, I'm going to cover these very, very briefly, but in my mind, this is what we need to do, okay? We have to talk about domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Sorry, I'm so used to calling it domestic violence, but whatever you want to call it, it's all the same. How much of a public safety issue is this? And I think you all understand that, but I'm going to give you some very good examples. What does high risk look like, and how do we manage it? And strangulation. Who here has taken training in strangulation? Good. That's really good. If I ask a medical audience, I might get one hand up, nurses and doctors alike. That's frightening. We need to change that. So stalking. Stalking is a precursor to homicide and domestic violence situations. So this is what we're going to talk about. Before you start the video here, this is what I want you to do. I want you to please listen to the language that this news reporter is doing, and then we're going to talk about it briefly after. Okay.
Nearly killed in a shootout with her strange husband wants you to know more about her personal experience with domestic violence.
Rose Turner lost an eye in the attack that also claimed the life of her mother and father. Tonight, our coverage of the murder in Calder continues with KXY4's Jeff Humphrey. In St. Mary's today, where Turner is still recovering from brain injury, but very clear on where her life took a deadly turn.
On the same day that their divorce was supposed to be final, Rick Turner shot his wife Rose and killed her parents. Now, 5 months later, Rose is ready to own up to the mistakes that she made in their relationship in the hopes of protecting other women in the future.
The shootings happened back in May at the top of this remote driveway above the St. Joe River. Turner and her parents were ambushed by Rose's estranged husband without warning.
He came to kill me. And he killed my parents.
He tried to kill me. Thank God I managed to live through it. Don't ask me how. I did. And he shot me. And he shot himself.
The shootings that shocked the nearby town of Calder were a violent end to a case of domestic violence that had dragged on for decades. Rose was still just a teenager the first time her future husband abused her.
I thought he had a bad life. And if I only loved him enough, I loved him enough and showed him and was there, that he would quit, that it would change.
Unfortunately, the violence continued, and by the time Rose realized her mistake, the couple already had several young children. Because of a wallet that was almost always empty, Rose was trapped in an abusive marriage with no exit strategy in sight.
You have kids that you have to take care of. You can't just run out with kids and not have a place to go and a place to take care of them and a home.
Finally, last April, with her children grown and Rose working at St. Mary's nursing home, she filed for divorce in the Benoit County courthouse. By then, she knew Rick had grown up watching his father abuse his mother, and now Rose worries about the cycle of domestic violence being passed on from generation to generation.
Women, girls, if you see this coming, if it's in a relationship, if it starts, if they start getting abusive, get out, because it's never going to stop.
Rose doesn't think that a restraining order could have protected her family from this shooting. She believes she sealed her own fate more than 20 years ago when she went ahead and married a man who had already demonstrated he was more than capable of domestic violence. Reporting near St. Mary's, Jeff Humphrey, Campbell, White Pool.
Ha! Who feels offended? Okay, this was in 2008. So do you think the media are better today? They're not, and I'm going to show you some examples. I had the opportunity last year, a year ago, to speak at a conference in Edmonton, and I did domestic violence in the media, because every time I see a tragedy reported, it's not reported correctly, and it's one of those things that just absolutely has to be addressed. And very good reasons for it. So in preparing for that presentation, I read a lot of research regarding domestic violence in the media, and this is what is very, very common. They miss the history and context of the relationship. They pretty much never discuss it. They use language that implies the victim may be responsible. Treat crime as an isolated event that no one could see coming. That drives me crazy, because we know that in 99% of the cases that's just not so. Well, maybe it's about 89% of the cases. And they miss risk factors that are well known to experts, and they don't seem to seek out experts. So here's an example. Okay, this is an Edmonton case. A fellow strangled his common law wife to death after a long history of police involvement and emergency protection orders being granted. He ultimately strangled her to death, wrapped her body in a rug and wrapped a rope around it, and then cut the gas line in the house, thinking that he would destroy the evidence of him murdering her, because they would be blown to smithereens. We don't know if he intended to kill himself along with that, because he stepped outside and lit a cigarette, and the house blew up, as well as the house next door on each side. Two men that were barbecuing in their backyard, neighbors, died. The mother of the wife of one of the men who died is a mother of a young baby, and they found her and her baby in the rubble of the basement, alive and okay, but injured. And 41 houses were either completely destroyed. It was a crescent, so all homes in that crescent location were either completely destroyed or seriously damaged. So this is how the media reports it. The troubled relationship. Okay, so is it a troubled relationship when he abuses to the point there's lots of police involvement and then he ultimately murders her? No, that's not a troubled relationship. That's a murder. Again here, so this is just an awful tragedy that happened on the highway in Alberta. It was a 21-year-old girl that had broken up with a very abusive boyfriend, and he followed her, driving her friends to the airport one night, managed to get their car pulled over. He gunned down 4 of them, and 3 died, and his ex-girlfriend's best friend survived, and then he killed himself. Okay, There were multiple gunshots. He unloaded. He was a gun nut, and he unloaded all of his rounds in these victims. So it was a complete overkill. Complete innocent people in the wrong place at the wrong time. How does the media report it? That the homicide thought to be jilted, former boyfriend. Jilted. I had to look up the definition of jilted because I intuitively knew that it was negative to me, but I wanted to know exactly what jilted means, and this is what it is out of the dictionary, right? To reject or cast aside a lover or sweetheart, especially abruptly or unfeelingly. That's what the media put on her. So what are we telling this 21-year-old girl? If you're in an abusive relationship with a boy that you don't want to be with anymore, don't break up with him. How dare you, right? That's the subliminal message that's getting through when that kind of language is being used, right? She is a victim. And I know about the history. There was a horrific history. He was a gun nut. He had an arsenal of weapons. He was abusive, controlling, threatened to kill her, had physically assaulted her earlier that night. They were separated. She couldn't get away from him. He was texting her repeatedly. Basically, he was stalking her. If she'd gone to the police and there was a thorough investigation, he could have been charged with criminal harassment, uttering threats, and assault. So workplace violence, okay? So according to the American Institute on DV, 74% of DV happens at the workplace. They're harassed by their abusers at the workplace. This is a significant public safety risk. And I probably don't even have to tell you, but every time you hear on the American news, especially where there's been a shooting at a workplace, inevitably it's a domestic violence based, or it's a disgruntled employer. It's one or the other, right? Somebody got fired or didn't like his boss, but it's one or the other. Those are the two reasons for mass murders in the workplace. And basically, it's considered a very high risk for security personnel. Do you remember last year in Wisconsin that a woman who owned a spa had left her husband, abusive husband? They had a son together, a child together, and he came into the spa when she was working on a Sunday, and he gunned down 7 of them, killing 3. What's really chilling, I'm not going to play it because I don't have time, but the media reported they got a hold of the recording of her being in court when she got a 4-year restraining order against him. And she said to the judge, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. So she knew, right? Do I have time? Okay, well, I didn't put it, I'm sorry, I didn't intend to, it's not on my jump drive, I can't play it. But, sorry. So, if you want to do something about public safety, pay more attention to domestic violence, right? So, why doesn't she leave? How many times have we heard that, right? I still hear it today. Sometimes I even ask myself that, to be truthful, because some things are so blatantly horrible I can't understand. I still can't understand. I understand, but I don't, right? But separation is the most dangerous. And of course, especially when there's children involved, right? This is when stalking behavior, the obsessive behavior really exacerbates. And the offender will use access to children to continue the abuse, continue the control, and continue that sort of thing. So I want to talk about the different types of partner violence. Is anybody familiar with Michael Johnson's? Very few of you. Okay, I think this is probably some of the most important research in the last decade to come out for intimate partner violence. But he says there's different types of domestic violence, and I say this all the time. Not all domestic violence is created equal. And it's very, very critical for us to understand that it's not, because we're doing a disservice to the real serious cases and victims of those cases when we clump them all together in one thing, and we're doing a disservice to the people who are just reacted to some isolated event on a one-time thing, and then they're treated in the system as though they're the worst offenders ever. This is not the way to treat domestic violence, because then we're not really properly addressing it. So according to Michael Johnson, he says there's basically 3 different kinds. And the first one is the most frightening, and he calls that partner the intimate terrorist. So this is where the violence is severe, it escalates, comes in multiple forms of abuse, terrorization, threats, controlling behavior. We've seen several of these people. A lot of these individuals, by the way, will have borderline personality disorder. Any mental health experts in the audience that understand personality disorders when you're working with offenders? Is borderline personality disorder a very common disorder and abusers? Absolutely, right? Because those guys are the ones that say, if you leave me, I will kill you. They have that immense fear of being abandoned. So they start becoming controlling and violent in order to not be abandoned. It seems counterintuitive, but that's what they do. So these kinds of abusers are, by and large, male perpetrators. And then he talks about situational couple violence, where the violence is moderate due to frustration or anger. It occasionally erupts. It can be severe and lethal, but, and then this is where there's more equal perpetration between men and women. But by and large, women have way more serious injuries, and they have lots more fear for their safety. All right, so there's the third one. So this is basically when a woman is in an intimate terrorist relationship and she fights back. Does she have to fight back at the moment of the abuse? No. It could be when nothing's happening to her and it's her only opportunity to do it and get out, right? So that's violent resistance or fighting back. And we all have heard cases in Canada where women eventually murder their male partner, and then they stand trial for murder, but you find out that they suffered and endured years of torture and violence at the hands of their partner. So if you look at the connection of these three individuals to child abuse, according to Dr. Johnson, so there's a huge correlation to child abuse with an intimate terrorist in the home. And not so connection with situational couple violence, and minimal when it's a violent resistance situation. So we know that these are always intertwined as well with child abuse. Okay, so has anybody read Familicidal Hearts? This is written by Dr. Neil Websdale. He is the director of death reviews for the United States of America. So he's been appointed by the government to do that, and he works out of Arizona. He wrote this book. What he did is he looked at the emotional styles of murderers. 196 were male murderers and 15 were female. And this is what he says. Basically, there's a continuum of what these kinds of individuals are on. But basically two. So he names them the livid, coercive hearts, who are emotionally and physically abusive, controlling towards their partners and children. Acts of familicide is consistent with their abusive behavior. So we look at that, that would be the domestic terrorist, right? And then he says there's these other guys that are called civil reputable hearts. They shock communities when they resort to familicide. And this is where they kill the whole family, correct? And it's not consistent with their behavior. So they're generally educated, well-employed, culturally more prominent in the culture. I'll give you an example. In Calgary, we had an Asian family that they were divorcing, and he was so depressed and so emotionally shamed because of the divorce, he murdered his 2 children and tried to kill her, but the police managed to intervene. There was no history of abuse. There was nothing indicating that this, and we see that occasionally. And there's reasons for it, but these do not happen very often. They're the very, very rare ones. So again, that tells us that there's things we can do, no matter what area we work in, to educate the rest of the world about the ones we need to be concerned about. Can't do much about those ones, but we can do a lot about the first one. And where we get our risk factors from, I won't go through these because you guys are familiar, you can get this online anywhere. But when we're talking about assessing risk for serious violence and abuse, did I go through all 39? I seem to be missing one of the slides. Yeah, maybe it's something. Okay. But there's 39 risk factors from Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review, right? They've increased them. It used to be 35. Now, this is where we get our risk assessment tools from, if you will, for lack of a better word. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with Be Safer in BC. Okay, Doctors Crop and Hart. Have you guys ever had Crop and Hart come and teach you? Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so Ontario Death Review, Sarah, Sam, Be Safer, that's all crop and heart. ODERA, that's out of Ontario. The Ottawa Police Service uses ODERA. It's a risk assessment tool. They use it every single domestic violence. It's mandated in Ottawa Police. And Jackie Campbell's danger assessment and risk for sexual violence by crop and heart as well. So those are just some examples of what we can use and teach ourselves and get. These are the rest of the Ontario Death Review factors. But if you're familiar with them at all, you can see, according to Sarah, the Ontario Death Review is, they completely overlap. So you have empirical clinical research that tells you what the risk factors are, and then you have in-depth reviews of actual deaths that say, yeah, that is the risk factors. So no matter where you are in the world or what culture you're in, these factors are going to remain constant. All right, so stalking. So there's, we call them relationship context typologies for stalkers. Has anybody ever taken stalking training about relationship context? No? Okay. 4 typologies according to this. They looked at a couple of thousand stalking cases in the US, and they looked at 300 cases of stalking in Ontario, and they did the research. One of the typologies of the 4 stalkers is called the intimate stalker. These guys are the most dangerous. So stalking in the context of intimate partner relationships is the most dangerous. So usually have a history of substance and abuse. They're the highest to threat, assault, and use weapons. They reoffend. They don't usually have a major mental illness, and they're very dangerous. So here's a case in Calgary again, where the victim was estranged from her husband. He stalked her so much, I don't know if you can read it, but it says he would rent cars so that she wouldn't detect him following her and watching her. And he was so obsessed with listening he put listening devices on her phone and in her car. He was so obsessed to listening to her all the time that he couldn't eat, work, or sleep. So he ultimately kills her. And if you can see it, she had something like, how many rib fractures? I think 30 rib fractures that killed her, and she was strangled as well. So, it was, again, overkill, but very, very, very serious stalking behavior that you could have predicted and prevented if you recognized it at the time. But stalking is fairly new in Canada. We've had stalking since 1993 only, and in the criminal code, that's new. It's still new. And I can be speaking to 200 police officers in a room, and not one of them will put their hand up for stalking training. Not one. So that's really disturbing. We're really trying to address that in Alberta. What about BC? Does BC get good police training in stalking? Does anybody here know? Probably not, hey? Yeah. Push for it, because they're not seeing it. If they're not getting the training, then they're not seeing it. And not only are they not seeing it, so then they're not investigating it, and they're not stopping it. And they are the most exciting cases, really. They're fascinating to do. Strangulation. I'll just touch on this very quickly. Strangulation, and there's a case out of the US, out of San Diego, 300 cases they looked at over a 5-year period from the most minor throat grab to death from strangulation. There were in 50% of the cases, no visible injuries to the exterior of the neck. Shocking, hey? I mean, you can die from strangulation and not even have a bruised neck because the underlying injuries can be so severe that's what causes death. And of course, we all know that bruising takes 24 hours, 48 hours to actually come out, right? So look for symptoms. And so this is one that I'm going to show you an example of. So the redness, bruising, any kind of marks to the jawline. Why to the jawline? Because she's lowering her head to protect her neck. It's just instinctive. So if somebody's going for your neck, you keep lowering your head, your jawline's going to get it. So here's the case here where the victim was strangled almost to unconsciousness 3 times in one evening by her partner. And the first time, or every time he'd get her in a chokehold from behind and choke her until she started to pass out. And one time he actually shoved because she was screaming, so he was on top of her, he flipped her over, and he actually stuck his hand down her throat, like in her mouth. He put his fist in her mouth so that she would stop screaming. And at that point, she severely bit and scratched his hands, okay? So when the police come, she's hysterical, and he's very calm. And she's already at the neighbors, and he's rocking their 2-year-old son in a chair. And he's calm and she's hysterical, so the police do not want to deal with her because she's hysterical. They want to talk to him. And he shows him the injuries to his hands, which are clearly self-defense if you have training, because there's no other way a woman is going to scratch and bite her partner's hands unless they're somewhere, you know, in close proximity to her face. So they were going to charge her for his hands, and then when they went through the house, they saw the scratch on her face, and they decided, well, okay, we'll charge him with common assault for that scratch on her nose. Do you see that? Because for them, they had to see it, something. And they didn't arrest him. They just released him on a promise to show up in court in 6 weeks from then, or whenever it was, and with no contact conditions, nothing protecting her. So the next day, she goes actually to her brother's and stays the night because she's so afraid. And the next day when she gets up, her brother takes these photographs. And so you can see inside her lips are bruised, and that's when he had his fist in her mouth and he was pushing her lips against her teeth. What's happening to her jawline here, her chin? It's red and it's starting to bruise and it's swollen from him grabbing her from behind like that, correct? And then she's covered in bruises. Now you can see the bruise on her chin better. Okay, so this event happened August 1st, 2002. At 2 weeks later, he got unsupervised access to their 2-year-old kid every other weekend. December 1st, 2002, he has a child. He takes him to a small town in Alberta where his parents live, phones her Sunday night at 6 o'clock when he's supposed to have the baby back, says, you're gonna have to come and get us. He's crying. And she's like totally panic-stricken, so she phones the detective in Calgary that was working on her case, who, by the way, added better charges, and once it got to the specialized unit, it was more properly dealt with proper conditions and so on. And he also had an emergency protection order. Anyway, they put an APB out for him in his truck, and that next morning, some farmer driving down the road found him and his 2-year-old son dead in the truck from shotgun wounds. This was preventable. And this is a prime example, again, of what happened is they went to family court, and she told the judge, he's charged with all these things. I'm scared he's going to kill me. I'm scared he's going to kill my kid. And he said to the judge, that's a lie. All the charges were dropped. And her lawyer look at each other. They can't believe it. They scurry out of the courtroom, phone the detective. He goes, no, the charges weren't dropped. But that's what the judge believed, because there's nobody there to say anything different, right? She's just left on her own accord. So that's just a bad example. So here are some of the things advocates can do with regard to changing the attitudes of the media and making them report these things like they really are. First of all, one of the things we can do is actually rename what domestic violence is. It isn't a troubled relationship. It isn't disharmony in the home, okay? It's sexual assault, forcible confinement, kidnapping sometimes, strangulation, aggravated assault, attempted murder, uttering threats, criminal harassment and stalking. That's what it is at its worst, correct? So raise public awareness and stimulate that public dialogue. Start calling it what it is. Engage them in some proactive education. Become routine sources for them. If you see that you've got a journalist that's continually writing about these things and you know a lot about it, phone her up and say, I'd like you to interview me about this, because I have lots of information I can tell you. Because they don't know you exist unless you get out there publicly somehow. They'll phone their regulars, right? They'll phone the director of a women's shelter or something, which is great, but sometimes it's not enough and it's not the same broadness of information that's being received. So be informed and inform others. That's the best advice I can offer. Develop at the local level. We have 8 domestic violence specialized courts across Alberta. Not one of them was government mandated or created by anything the government did. They were all created from the ground up. So they were created by people in that community that wanted to address domestic violence better than it's being done. That's how these things happen, from the ground up, developing at the local level. Don't wait for the government to help you because there's way too much bureaucracy and it takes years and years and years. Do it yourself. Share information informally. Don't pass paper back and forth, but case conference and talk about cases. Don't be afraid about information sharing because you could be saving a life if you actually talk about a case. And nobody is ever going to hold you accountable for saving a life. Okay, so don't be afraid, be brave. Obtain consent of the victim and exchange information. I just heard about a community organization in a small town in Alberta where they've got this huge Sudanese population, immigration population, and now Mexico and the Philippines because of the big plant that's there, and they're bringing all these immigrants in. You can imagine what the police were facing. The RCMP reached out to the community and said, help us. So they built a team. They're doing things like if her tires got slashed, they're calling a local mechanic or auto repair shop and getting her new tires so she can go to work so she doesn't go back to him because she can't work, right? They're fixing those basic things that empower the victim and help her get out. It's so great to hear. So safety planning, of course, you guys know this. You guys have ICAT teams. That sounds fabulous. It's basically along the same lines. You are doing this stuff. I want to end my presentation with this photograph. So this is a photograph of the grave side of a man that had literally terrorized his wife for an entire year after they separated, till he ultimately gunned them down, his 3-year-old son, her, and then he killed himself. What's wrong with this picture? Everything, right? Is that shocking or what? Okay, it's hearts, that's obvious. They're buried together, that's obvious. What else is wrong? Tell me. Because it took me a long time to see it. His heart's bigger. Who didn't notice that? Because it took me a long time. Somebody in an audience like this pointed that out to me. Because I'm old, and I was socialized not even to see that as anything unusual. He's the patriarch, right? This is wrong. This is not the right image at all. Why are they buried together like that? Because they had 2 young adult children in their late teens when this occurred. And the people from that city where it occurred have told me that the kids picked this because this is what they want. Also, why I like this photograph is because it's symbolic. What is it symbolic of? How complex these cases are. That the father could do this and the 2 older children still want this. That's normal. Right? So these are the hurdles we're always working against in this environment, right? It's not like any other crime. So we have to treat it differently. And then, of course, this is a United Nations publication. It's a book called Broken Bodies, Broken Dreams. Violence Against Women Exposed. Everyone has a role to play because the challenge implicates every community and nation of the world and involves all women and, more pointedly, all men. Ending violence against women and girls is a struggle of historic and universal dimensions. The battle is already underway, and once won, humanity's place will more aptly and honestly be called civilization. How true is that? That's it, you guys. Thank you very much. Oh, sure. Okay.
We have some time if anyone has any questions for Val. Please feel free. We have a couple mics set up, so we'll open the floor to some questions.
You use the term choice. I'm really loud.
I can repeat the question if you're shy to stand up.
You use the terms choking and strangulation.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so she pointed it out that I use choking and strangulation, simultaneously. And that's because choking is not what it is. Choking is when something gets stuck in our throat. That's choking. Strangulation is when there's pressure applied to our necks, which cuts off our oxygen and blood supply to our brain. We call it choking because that's what victims call it. He choked me. So I use their language, but technically, when you cut off somebody's circulation by squeezing their neck, that's strangulation. When I teach police, I say, right, when you're doing a strangulation investigation, please use the language strangulation. Don't use the language choking, because then the prosecutor who gets it will just subliminally minimize it. If you call it strangulation, then we're going to look at it like strangulation and treat it as serious as it is. So that's a very good question. But victims will keep calling it choking.
Hi, good morning. I'm just curious, you said that your IPV team will get tires for a victim if her tires have been slashed. I'm just curious to know your resources because we have trouble getting a bus ticket for victims to leave town.
Okay,
so.
I just learned of this initiative. Yeah, I know. I just learned of this. It's not in my town. It's a small town in southern Alberta. The RCMP. I testified last week at a fatality inquiry of a woman who was murdered by her partner as an expert, and that's where I learned about it. One of the RCMP officers who testified before me talked about it, and then we talked about it after, and he sent me what I can do is I can send Tracy the link. You can talk to that community. There's a coordinator, an intake coordinator. Talk to that person and find out how they engage their community to provide those services and where they're getting funding from, okay? So I'll send that to Tracy.
Not shy. Just be grateful I'm not bursting into song at this exact moment. So thank you so much. I just had a question around industry development and when a community like, for example, Fort Mac, et cetera, embarks on that journey and the impacts to families and to women. And you mentioned one, I can't remember if it was a study or some examples of that, and what communities can do to prepare for that kind of an event in terms of an economic change. Sometimes it's a very positive change in the sense that there's a big boom, and other times there's a negative change, like for example what happened in Burns Lake when the mill blew up. So we know from our own information from our victim services workers that in Burns Lake, for example, incidences of domestic violence did increase after that incident. So it's a big question, but I'm curious about your experience or advice on that.
Did the incidents increase, or was it the reporting that increased? So because when you raise
I'd probably have to say reporting, but I don't have the actual facts.
So when we what's that? The mill closed. Well, so people are depressed. They have too much time on their hands. They're drinking too much. It's a sociological issue as well, right? But we found in Alberta, the more public awareness we raise, the more reporting we get, because women start feeling safer to report. So it does have that. It does have that effect, but that's not a bad effect. That's a good thing. It's a good thing when they feel safer and like that something's going to be done. That's a really good thing. Yes. Oh, it blew up. Oh my gosh, okay. But still, people are unemployed, they've been traumatized. Yeah, it's ripe for a setting of not good things happening. Any other questions? Oh, okay.
Thanks for commenting. Well, thanks for your presentation in general. Thanks for commenting on the disconnect between family law, family court, and criminal court. Can you make a comment on the role the family lawyer can play in attempting to get documentation in terms of what's happening on the criminal side and presenting that in a custody hearing, perhaps through a Freedom of Information application or through contacting Crown? Do you have any experience or any strategies you can share?
I do.
Because that's a really difficult issue.
Okay, going through the Freedom of Information, it will take so long and it'll be vetted so significantly that it'll be useless by the time the victim can use it in court. It will have no good use. One of the things, it's a very, very difficult thing to overcome. You can subpoena the police officer that investigated it. If there's a trial or if there's a hearing, encourage family lawyers, oh God, the police are going to kill me for saying this, but if it's a really serious case and there's horrific history, subpoena the police officer, especially when you have specialized domestic violence units in larger police agencies. They don't mind doing this at all because they know how critical it is. We have, well, fortunately, the unit I was the director of in Alberta for 6 years, we had everybody working together, so we would do formalized threat assessments that were pages long. We got every single police report on an individual, all child protection files from Children's Services, all corrections material, any psych assessments or anything this person had ever had done in his past. And we did formalized threat assessments because our members were certified threat assessors, and they were always subpoenaed to family court whenever they wrote one. If the family lawyer knew we had it, she'd subpoena us. And that way, we're subpoenaed to court to bring our report. We're sharing information because the court has ordered us to. Otherwise, we couldn't share it with her, so, or him. So that's one thing you can do. Do you guys have any frontline tools that the police officers use at bail hearings? So if you can get your hands on those, because they become a public record basically, unless there's a publication ban on the bail hearing, if you can get your hands on that, or do a risk assessment yourself with the victim using the danger assessment or the Be Safe or whatever, and then present that to the court. Some judges are familiar with these and they'll pay heed to them, and others will be oblivious. But when you start pushing those kinds of things, what you're actually doing is training the bench, right? That's what you're doing.
We've had recent amendments to our provincial privacy legislation to allow public bodies to share information where there's a risk of domestic violence.
That's good.
So that might be another avenue.
Yeah, she was just saying that there's new legislation that allows public bodies to share information where there's domestic violence. That's public bodies is a pretty limited scope. It doesn't help community agencies, but it's still a step in the right direction for sure. Yes?
Excuse me, do you have any strategies about how we can get this information to judges, to Crown, to police officers in a more complete way? Because your presentation was great, but you're pushing to the converted.
Yeah, I know.
And we've heard for the second time in 3 days how the least paid, least respected sector of this whole problem is being asked to educate judges.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right, and we've used the danger assessment, and sometimes it gets acknowledged, and other times it doesn't. But we need those other people like yourself and your colleagues.
Yeah, you do. You have, you gotta find champions from within the Crown Prosecution Service and the Police Service to help change the way they do, bail reports for court and that sort of thing. That's one thing. I know that's easier said than done. The question is, how do you guys get the bench more educated? How do you get this information before the court? I can tell you that in Alberta, the Government Police Advisory Committee created a form called Family Violence Investigative Report. It's mandated. We made it mandated, so every frontline police officer has to ask 19 risk questions. But we have a case in Alberta called it's Regina and E.M.B as in Bob period. And it's a 2000 Queen's Bench decision by Justice Peter Martin, who's now on the Alberta Court of Appeal. So it's even more authoritative. You guys can use that in BC. Encourage your Crown to use it, where it says that a justice shall not decide whether to detain or release an accused unless at least these 7 things have been canvassed. Does the complainant fear for her safety? And the basis for her fear. Does she think that he'll oblige by any court orders? Is there any history of mental illness, alcohol, or drug abuse? Is there a history of violence in the past? So the 7 most high-risk factors are actually law in Alberta, common law in Alberta, if you will. So we took that, and the first 7 questions of our fever report answer that, and the others are like, is there a history of strangulation? Has he ever strangled you? Has he ever used weapons? Has he ever threatened you? Does he hurt the kids? Has he hurt pets? Has he forced sex upon you? So we're trying to get a more contextual thing. I can tell you that that's been mandated in Alberta for 5 years, and it is only now that judges are actually asking for it. They're saying, where's the fever? Do you know how good that is? Like, it's amazing. So if you can get something consistent that they start to rely upon and they start to see its value, it's slow. But those are the kinds of things you need to do.
So I can't resist asking you this question. I know you talked about when the police arrive and the woman is so hysterical and he's so calm. We've had cases where a police officer will arrive and he speaks English, she doesn't speak English. Yeah. She's hysterical, police officer doesn't understand her. And so actually a woman gets charged. In some cases, a woman has picked up the knife to defend herself. Yeah. And the police charges her because he can explain. Yes. And she can't. So what do you do when there is a language issue, culture issue, everything else, she doesn't know the system at all.
Yeah.
She doesn't have an advocate. How do you deal with that?
Well, do the police services here, it's mostly RCMP and Vancouver Police, right, in BC, by and large? Yeah. Do they have interpreter services? Okay, so they should be calling for an interpreter.
Can I just tell you something about interpretation as well?
Yeah. That's another issue? Okay. Yeah.
Because you see, if you get a male interpreter on the phone, usually it's on the phone that people get the interpreters on. That woman is not going to, she doesn't trust her husband. How is she going to trust?
Yeah.
So there are many, many difficulties with that interpretation.
It's a training issue for sure. Okay, I have a whole presentation on dual charging, a whole presentation. If you have 2 hours, I'd be happy to give it to you. But we do that with police. We train them about dual charging and dominant aggressor investigations. And that, so our front line, to the extent that we can reach the front line in masses and make sure that they've all got this education is a challenge always. But in all of our training that we do with police, a dual charging and a dominant aggressor section is always contained therein. So we try to reduce that. Language barriers and cultural barriers are more specialized, and that's a problem everywhere. Yes?
I work on the prevention side of things with a feminist organization doing a lot of education in schools. And one of the things that we do is work with both young men and young women around awareness of what intimate partner violence looks like. And I like the term IPV as opposed to domestic violence because we understand that much of violence that women will experience starts when they're teenagers in school. So we feel that it's imperative that education is a part of the equation. And I really super grateful for what you're doing, and I love that quote up there. I've written it down. I'm going to use it. I'm wondering if you can comment broadly on one of the statistics that we use, and that is that 80% of women who experience domestic violence in their lives have it start when they're teenagers. In their teenage years. I'm wondering if you have any, if you can shed any light on that statistic, because it's always seemed like it's a really shocking one to me. Or if anybody else has any insight on that.
Well, we've all heard the statistics, right? The research will show that often women who are abused come from homes where abuse was prevalent, correct? And in a general sense, boys that grow up in homes like that will become abusive in a general sense, and girls will become victims in a general sense. Not always the case, but primarily that's where it comes from. I would love to see more proactive education in the schools, because girls at a young age do confuse jealousy and obsessive behavior with, oh, he really loves me. See, that's what needs to be cleared up and quickly, because often it's too late by the time they get involved. But a girl that has not, this is a thing. This is, for me, domestic violence or intimate partner violence, we have to start when they're this big. Not when they're 25 years old and already have been seriously abused or seriously abusing someone. It has to start at that age, and we have to fix the families that are dysfunctional where this is occurring, because that's where it's learned. And we don't have long-term planning for anything like that. I'm really upset that the schools, I still don't see it in the schools. I see spurts of experts, like the mother of somebody their daughter was murdered, she'll try to get into the schools, but it sort of just fizzles out. There's no real educational training or plan. I heard our minister